You're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. Today, I'll be speaking with economist Martin Hart-Landsberg. We'll be discussing inequality and capitalist globalization in East Asia. If you enjoy the work that we do and would like to support us, you can go to our website, theanalysis.news. You can hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen and make sure you get onto our mailing list. That way, we can send all of our new content straight to your inbox. Make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you get notifications every time we publish new content. And you can also listen to us on podcast streaming services such as Apple or Spotify. All right, let's get into it with Martin Hart-Landsberg. Joining me now is Martin Hart-Landsberg. He is a professor emeritus of economics at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. He's an author of several books, including Capitalist Globalization, Consequences, Resistance, and Alternatives, as well as a few books on Korea. One of them is called Korea Division, Reunification, and U.S. Foreign Policy. So, Marty, it's really great to have you here today. Thank you for joining.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So I wanted to speak to you about capitalist globalization, given that you've done a lot of research in China, Japan, and Korea. And if we look at the global capitalist system, we see a lot of countries, particularly in the global south, experiencing unsustainable debt. And so the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Bank, continue to argue that neoliberal policies present a solution to these economic crises. And they continue to assert that neoliberal policies as well as structural adjustment programs be implemented. But do you really see neoliberalism as alleviating poverty, or do these policies simply continue to exacerbate a lot of the existing inequalities in the global system?
Well, I would say it's the latter, but just to kind of put the debt crisis that you mentioned in some kind of perspective, the last decade, even according to the World Bank, there has been no reduction in global poverty. In fact, the World Bank in its most recent report said that it could take, without drastic action, it could take more than a century to eliminate poverty as it is defined for nearly half the world. And so you have to understand that we're entering into a debt crisis, and the last decade has essentially been a lost decade. Poverty is bad when the international agencies come up with multiple measures of it. So what they do is they take a bundle of goods in a country, say haircuts, a shirt, and then they take the same bundle of goods in the United States and they compare the prices and they make an exchange rate so that there should be kind of equivalence. So the lowest level of poverty that the international agencies use is $2.15 a day, which is about $785 a year. If you make above that, you're not considered poor, which is a little staggering. And about 10% of the world is below that level. Then they have another level, which is $6.85 a day, compared to U.S. living standards, $2,500 a year. And about 45% of the world's population is below that. Okay. And for the last 10 years, no improvement. And now a debt crisis. And so what does that mean? Over the last 10 or 12 years, ever since kind of the global financial crisis, the exports of these countries, which are largely been shaped by this global system and limited, have not earned very much. And so if countries follow the free market, people are free to import as they want. And as they try and import, if the imports grow faster than the exports, they have to find a way to pay for it. And that's usually been borrowing. And so over these years, they've been borrowing more and more money to cover this imbalance. But because they don't want to get too big into debt, they keep their growth slow so people are poor and they don't import so much. But over the last several years, what's happened, particularly with COVID, is the price of energy and food went way up. So imports went way up and interest rates went way up. And almost all the loans that these countries took out are on flexible rates. Even the IMF, when it loans to countries, uses a flexible rate. Even China, which is a major lender to the global south, 45% of their loans are flexible rates. So all of a sudden now, the amount that these countries have to pay is enormous to them. Here's just extreme examples. Mozambique and Angola now have to pay, have debt servicing costs that are equal to 20% of their GDP, right? Almost half the countries of Africa have to pay in debt more than they spend on healthcare and education combined. Latin America, Bolivia is an extreme case. They have reserves of about $1.5 billion when they used to have reserves of 15 billion. So what happens when you suddenly have a debt crisis? How do you solve a debt crisis? Well, you either can borrow more to pay and no one wants to lend them, or you have to make your citizenry poorer. And how does that work? Well, you don't want people to buy food if you subsidize it. So you end the subsidies, they can't afford food, you reduce your imports. If they're using healthcare and you have to import things for healthcare, you stop letting them do that. And then their healthcare goes down, but you don't have to import it. You make people poorer, they buy less, and you essentially bring the imports down. And that's why the World Bank says going forward, it's going to be a century to try and do anything because these countries are now going to be going into reverse. And then we get to the question of, well, why are they in this situation? Why is it that opening up, following a free market strategy of reducing consumer and business activity to solve the debt crisis, why are they in that situation? And here I think models matter, and South Korea is the country I want to use. South Korea was a very poor country in 1960. By the end of the 80s into the 90s, it was widely considered a success story. And so international agencies go around and they say, "Oh, you're doing so poor. You need to do like what South Korea does." And South Korea is a free market miracle. And so, for example, I was in South Korea in the early 90s after the Soviet Union ended, and the IMF had a tour group of people from some of the Eastern European countries, but some from Africa, some from Latin America, and they were there to learn about the South Korean miracle. And they were told by Korean professors, oh, this is, they welcomed foreign investment, they were open to free trade, the government stayed out of the economy, and that's how they succeeded, which is not the case. And I want to go back to that in a second. But I visited this professor and I said, I hear you're telling them that X, Y, and Z. That's not my understanding. And he said, no, it's not mine either. But the IMF wants this story out. So it puts pressure on the president of the university who tells me, and I do this. The same thing happened in South Africa with when the ANC took off. They said, you need to be like Korea. So what is the Korean experience? Well, when Park Chung-hee took over with a military takeover in 1961, he created an economic planning bureau. And that bureau had the ability to control foreign direct investment, foreign borrowing. What did that mean? Not a single foreign direct investment came into Korea that included a takeover of a domestic company. Not a single foreign direct investment came into Korea to set up production of a domestic consumption good. The only foreign investment that was allowed was investment that would support Korean economic activity. The government took over the entire banking system. Same thing in Taiwan. So one question you have to say to yourself is, how did Korea and Taiwan, for example, have the ability to take over the entire banking system, to limit things like this in places like Guatemala and other places, countries? If governments even try liberal, land reform, they get threats by the U.S. But the U.S. wanted these countries to succeed, so it allowed them to do this. So, for example, further examples, Korea and Taiwan had limits on imports. When you say to yourself, how did Korea get such an incredible industry to produce consumer electronics? Because they limited, there was never a Japanese consumer electronics sold in South Korea. They had limits on imports. They controlled them through a variety of complex ways. Every company had to belong to a producer association. You couldn't produce unless the government let you in. Why is it that Hyundai produces cars and Samsung doesn't? Because the Korean Ministry of Trade and Industry said to Samsung, we don't see your contribution to the auto industry, so we don't allow you in. And maybe just as a last example, to get a sense of what planning means, when Korea controls its banking system, it can pump money into the industries it wants to grow. So, for example, it wanted to start having tanker industry and shipping industry, but it didn't have a company that produced it. So it went to Hyundai and said, we're just going to give you the money to start shipbuilding. And how does Hyundai do that? Well, Hyundai controls an auto industry, a cement industry, a construction industry. It pulls people out, moves them into shipbuilding. They produce ships. At first, there's no demand. So the government says all oil coming to Korea has to be on Hyundai ships. And Korea now has an incredible shipbuilding industry. So very tightly planned, controlling who gets money, what the imports are, what foreign investment, nothing like what the IMF is saying. Now, one of the problems is, of course, that this was a dictatorship, tremendous repression of workers, which added to that. And one of the things for me when I would visit in Korea in the late 80s and early 90s was that workers had a sense that state planning is what elevated them. But what would it mean to democratize the state planning system? How do you ensure that instead of an export-driven economy, which pits workers against each other, you can create an economy that's more domestically centered, that produces goods and services that are responsive to people? And so there were really, really rich discussions and debates that got short-circuited by repression against the left in South Korea. But the point is that the IMF and World Bank continue to kind of put these things forward, that the free market will solve countries' development problems, when the experiences of successful countries like Korea, like Taiwan, even like People's Republic of China, show that it's planning. I'm not trying to romanticize it, because in many cases, these are governments that are also repressing labor, but these are techniques and strategies that you need to restructure economies. And the problem is that the developed capitalist countries are not very eager to see other countries follow suit. So, in fact, why is the Korean economy struggling now? Because Japan and the United States didn't like the competition. And so they pursued strategies which end up leading to a debt crisis for Korea and the unraveling of its planning. So there's a lot going on. The important thing to say is that the successes in economic development have come from planning. And most economists don't learn about these things. How does planning work? Under what conditions? And what an international agency should be doing is strengthening countries' capacities to plan, rather than telling people that planning doesn't work and pursuing loans and advice that undermines their ability to plan.
I do want to ask you a bit more about this unraveling in the South Korean context, but could you just clarify one thing? Because what you're describing to me sounds like a protectionist economy, not the creation of free market economic zones or the implementation of free market ideology. So is this a false dichotomy, or was this really free market ideology that was being put into practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's the exact opposite of free market economics. And in fact, Park Chung-hee, who made took over with a military dictatorship, his work in the military had been studying North Korea and its planned economy. And he had been a soldier, an officer in the Japanese military when Japan colonized Korea, which was very a planning experience. So he was not a fan of planning. And the difference is that Korea exported, but it continually used its protection and its domestic control to create the ability to keep upgrading and export higher quality goods. So it wasn't only focus on domestic or only focus on global, but it created an overall plan. So if South Korea said, we want to be a auto producer, the government set up its own steel industry to provide cars. and it restricted, you could not buy a Japanese car in South Korea. So you could sell cars in Korea, become more efficient, and then export them. So there was kind of a sense of both, of working to integrate them. What happened over time, um, and this gets back to understanding how the global economy operates. People may remember in the 1980s, the US was running very big trade deficits, and particularly Japan was seen as the problem. And so whenever the US runs into a threat, it seeks to use its strength to stop that threat. So it said to Japan and Germany, in fact, because they were running trade deficits with Germany, you need to take actions to solve our balance of payments problem. And the agreed action was for Germany and Japan to raise the value of their currency so their goods would become more expensive to US consumers. What happened then is that the Koreans didn't change their currency and they began increasing their sales to the US. And so the Koreans began replacing the Japanese in selling consumer electronics and cars and other things. Well, the Japanese said unacceptable. So they cut off the supply of critical technologies to Korean companies. And the US said unacceptable. And they forced Korea to raise the value of their currency. And gradually, Korea's export offensive unraveled, and they had to borrow more and more money. And then in the late 1990s, there was a financial crisis when investors said, wait, these countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia and Korea are running bigger and bigger trade deficits, and who knows if they can pay back debts, and they pulled out their money, and these economies collapsed. The IMF came into South Korea and said, take apart your planning system. You can't control, you have to sell off your banks. You can't control imports. You have to let more foreign investment in. And for the big companies who had been created by the planning system, they said, great, that gives us more freedom to go abroad because we were always carefully controlled. We can now make money in different industries. We don't want the planning system. And now we can also, through globalization, as Korean companies have done, make more money producing other places. And as a result, Korea over the last decade, 2 decades, has had very slow growth, growing inequality, and economic problems. So the issue is not just, is there a perfect strategy? It's a global capitalist system where countries like the US and Japan and European Union are always on the alert to see when there are rivals, and there may be historical moments when they'll support a country's rise, allowing a Taiwan or Korea to control its economy. But if it gets too threatening, they take steps to undermine it.
So would you say that Korea fell in line after that? Because now we see stagnation in the Korean economy, and there's, not a very strong labor movement in Korea, and there are a host of all other sorts of problems there. We don't need to speak about the problems with the current president who was impeached, but I mean that is illustrative of a lot of the tensions within Korean society. But would you say that the country kind of fell in line and started to not push back against American hegemony? And is that also why Samsung is still such a huge exporter, or how do you account for those factors?
Yeah, no, it's, state planning in Korea built up these very large, powerful companies like Hyundai and Samsung, but state planning could keep them in check. You'll make a lot of money, but you'll do it in the ways that we say. There's a lot of corruption, but it's through production and investment as the state planners wanted. And what happened after the financial crisis in the late 1990s is that the IMF said these restrictions have to be removed. And for the big companies, that was good. It wasn't ideal for them. There wasn't a crisis, but it was a silver lining. And so they have taken advantage of that. And as a consequence, um, their power is kind of unchecked. And so Korea has become a much more typical capitalist economy that's been globalized. And I think what's happened also is that, the labor movement's a lot weaker. When you have companies that are globalizing, being militant isn't always a good answer. You go on strike and they say, great, we're moving to Vietnam, we're moving to China, we're setting up production in the United States. And so I think the labor movement is in South Korea are really struggling to say, we need a new kind of economy, but what does that look like? And how do we approach that? And I think they've lost a lot of the kind of insights and strength that they had in the past. So I think right now, the powers that be in Korea have embraced this globalization because their dominant companies are kind of free to make money.
Right, and they're also a signatory to the World Trade Organization, right? So there's a lot that they can't really change or adjust in favor of workers because they've signed on to these really brutal contracts, right?
And just to kind of put this also, I think to give a real sense of how the IMF, the World Bank, the US, how they really play games. I don't know how much they believe, but how they really play games in talking about the free market and globalization and how it helps is what happened in Western Europe after World War II. When the war ended, most of Western Europe had been devastated by the war. And the US said, open up your economies, be free market. And Western Europe said, if we do that, we're going to pull in a lot of imports. We can't export much because of our industries are weak. And we're going to run into a debt problem. And we're going to have to then repress our economy. And we have strong lefts in France and Italy and other places. And who knows what will happen. So we're going to refuse. And because during the Depression and the war, a set of controls had developed, and European capital and its state had capacities, they resisted the US. So what the US ended up doing was negotiating something called the European Payments Union. And so beginning in 1950, the US allowed the Western European countries to essentially maintain a closed collective system where, for example, if a Swedish farmer wanted to buy a German tractor and there was not foreign exchange, they would go to the Swedish central bank and pay in kroner. And the German central bank would then pay the German tractor producer in Deutschmarks. And all of these things would be track would be kept. The central banks would keep track of all this. At the end of the month, they would total up their relative balances in their inter-European trade, report them to the Bank of International Settlements, who would keep a record. And at the risk of oversimplifying, they would say, well, if you're a country that ran kind of a bit of a deficit, we'll just give you free credit so you don't have to repress your economy. And if you're in a surplus situation, we'll give you some of the foreign exchange you would have earned, but not all of it. And we keep controls on. So you can't just go in there and say, here's my currency, give me dollars so I can buy from the US. It's all limited. You can't just buy any goods. There's quotas, restrictions. And European Union existed in this program of a regional planned economy, a regional economy from 50 to 1958. It wasn't until 1958 that they made their currencies convertible, that they dropped their controls on imports. Well, if developed capitalist countries need 8 years of planning and control over imports and control over exports to feel secure, why would we expect countries who have undergone the kind of exploitation that most of the countries in the global South have to open up and to actually succeed? And so there's time and time again when big capital knows that development is important, they have created space for planning for powerful states.
Can you speak about how the conditions in East Asian countries such as Japan, China, and Korea have changed over the past few decades? Because now we see that a lot of, multinational corporations have set up in China, for example. And I know a lot of your work has dealt with China in particular and how, there's been a huge U.S. China trade deficit over the years. And China has, over the past decade or so, also imported goods from other parts of East Asia to then assemble them in China and then export those, final I don't know what the term is, produced goods after they've reassembled them themselves.
The
Um,
final goods. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So how have those dynamics changed as well in terms of how China and Vietnam and Korea and countries in East Asia interact with one another and what the implications also are for Chinese workers.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. I guess one thing to say is that the way global capitalism is operated has made almost every country export oriented. And that's a real problem because it ends up pitting workers against each other and um, essentially ignoring what workers in different countries need for their own consumption. But everybody's competing to produce the highest value goods, the luxury goods, the consumer goods for the richest markets. And there's no sense of balance. And everybody can't produce those unless they end up fighting among each other and workers getting pitted against each other and conditions deteriorating for workers. But to go back, when I mentioned about the U.S. demanding that Japan and Germany raise their currency value, the response in Japan was, well, we're going to hold back on selling imports to Korea, but we need to do something. And so their big companies began to shift first to Thailand, then to Malaysia, and then when China opened up, to China. One of the reasons that Japan has had decades of stagnation is because Japanese companies are no longer investing primarily in Japan. They have globalized. And once Japan started to move to China and producing with lower Chinese wages, Korean companies had to say, well, how can we outcompete Japan producing in Thailand, Malaysia, and China, exporting to the US and the EU with our higher wages? Well, we need to start moving. So they began to move to China as a way to compete and also sometimes to sell parts and components and technology to the Japanese companies moved. And so what you begin to get is kind of these dominant countries maintaining some capacities in their home country, but increasingly moving production to China. Same thing happened in Taiwan. Uh, by the mid 90s, 50% of Taiwanese foreign investment was going to China, all their semiconductors, for example. And then, but it's not just only to China, because sometimes parts and components could be produced in Malaysia and Indonesia. And so big capital is just looking to say, where can we get the best deal? Where can we put something production in? And so what happened is where in the 80s and into early 90s, a lot of countries had companies who produced full finished products and exported them. In East Asia, their countries become subject to these global processes and they become essentially integrated together. So goods that are produced in China, assembled in China, may come from some parts in South Korea, some parts in Japan, some parts in Malaysia, Taiwan. And so, but where does the final good go? Mostly to the US or to the European Union or maybe Japan. And so East Asia became kind of part of a globalized production network. And most of the production was organized by these global corporations. Many of them came from the United States, increasingly coming from Germany as well. And so those operations mean that that China became the world's workshop. That's where most production was. One of the challenges for the West is that although, in my opinion, China has become a capitalist country, I know that's kind of a debatable position, but its manufacturing sector is largely private, is that China's state capacities, which remain significant, have meant that they were able to take advantage of some of this and build up their own state institutions, their own state industries, and are now not just a simpler assembler of basic goods and services, but direct competitors to Japan and the United States and Germany. And China is a very big country. I mean, its resources and it wasn't a typical third world country. Even when China began its marketization in the late 70s, early 80s, people have often said, oh, under Mao, China was this failure. It was far from that. It had an educated working class. It had a healthy working class. It was building computers. It had missiles, heavy, ocean-going vessels. So it had capacities to draw on and to use these investments, and so now it's the number one market for all of East Asia because they're selling their parts and components, but it's become a much more independent producer. And and in that sense, I think for the U.S. and Japan and Germany, they're now feeling the pressure of the export orientation. And China, like all these countries, has become a major exporter. Its growth is not from domestic consumption, but it's largely export oriented. And so the problem is that globalization just keeps reinforcing this export activity to the detriment of workers in all these countries.
Right, so it's becoming more export oriented, but does that mean that the manufacturing base itself has expanded? Like, are there more manufacturing jobs in China now, or is that not the case?
Total manufacturing employment in China is going down. It's becoming more capital intensive, and the economy has changed. What the data seems to suggest is that more Chinese companies are producing the parts and components that they used to import from other countries. But in the core areas of technology, the semiconductors, the operating systems for phones and computers, they're still dependent on imports. They haven't reached the same level that a lot of the Western companies have. But China has succeeded in localizing a lot of production. And as a consequence, they're not depending on imports from Thailand, Malaysia, and other countries as much, and that's affecting their growth. So China's, but the overall manufacturing employment within China has been going down, and unemployment in China is actually going up. One of the things where the Chinese sort of mask this is um, in China, where you're born, you have a household registration system. And if you move from a rural area to an urban area, you maintain your household registration system in the rural area. So when nowadays in China, I'd say two-thirds of the manufacturing workforce are internal migrants. But because they don't have a household registration system in the urban area where they live, they are not counted as unemployed when they lose their jobs. They don't have access to public services because they're not citizens. So they can't send their kids, even if they have kids there, to public schools free. They can't access the subsidized healthcare. But it also means that their lower wages are not counted when the Chinese government lists what are the average wages, what's the average unemployment. They only count workers with a registration system in the urban area. So one of the reasons that consumption keeps falling as a percent of production in China is this kind of downward pressure on wages in China. And that's led Chinese companies to actually start to move from the old areas where they originally produced to the interlands of China where the wages are even cheaper. That's not only Chinese companies, but for example, Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company that left Taiwan to go to the People's Republic of China. Taiwan is now struggling economically because so many of its companies have left. And places like companies like Foxconn are then moving from the populous areas of China to other places in China where they can get cheaper wages. So the whole globalization process is such that, yes, China has localized more, but the context isn't necessarily so advantageous for Chinese workers.
So you were speaking about the pressures which have been placed on Chinese workers and have led to wage stagnation. And wage stagnation is obviously a huge issue in the North American context. If you look at real wages, so when you take inflation into account, wages have not really increased all that much for the average American worker over the past 50 years or so. There's been widespread wage stagnation. And you also pointed out in another article how the consumption of Chinese goods by the American worker has largely been driven by bubbles in various sectors of the American economy. So if you look at the housing market, for example, the housing bubble of 2007 is what largely drove a lot of that consumption. And then, of course, we saw when that bubble burst, what financial catastrophe it actually led to. So I think this is a moment for us to segue into a foreign policy issue and look at U.S. China foreign policy. So Biden just gave his last foreign policy speech. He said that China will never be able to surpass the United States, and that the United States is in a much better position after 4 years of Biden's presidency to face China as a perceived threat. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think the China hawks perceive China as a threat rather than just simply a competitor?
Well, it's a good question. I think almost any time the US has faced a very serious economic competitor, they viewed them as a threat. So I use the example of Japan when they forced the Japanese to raise their currency. They actually said, not only raise your currency, but we want you to control how many semiconductors you send and how many cars. So they took pretty strong action, but they were able to do that. They also still had the military dominance and the political dominance, and they were able to force Japan to do what they wanted. When Korea had its crisis in the late 90s, the US was actually pivotal in forcing and pressing the IMF to demand that Korea unravel its planning. They saw it as an economic competitor and a threat, but they also had the political and military kind of overarching power to force Korea to accept that. Um, the problem with the case of the Chinese economy is that it's far bigger than Korea and Japan, and U.S. capital has been very invested in China for a lot of, like our car companies have bigger markets in China than at home. Apple relies on China for, huge amounts of production. Um, we import, I'd say, almost all of our consumer electronics in one way or the other come from China. Where in Japan and Korea, US capital was less integrated into those. So it was easier to just sort of say, you're an economic competitor, we demand you do X and Y. The US has a much more difficult time dealing with China as a competitor because it's very diverse now, and US capital is so interwound with a lot of production there that how do you handle it? We 40% of China's exports to the US are parts and components that go into US production. 50, 60% of its imports are electronics goods produced usually in concert with US companies. So I think for the US state to try and deal with China, they turn it into not just a competitor, but a threat, a national security threat, because they need an extra level of um, impetus to try and force companies to do things they don't want to do. Where with Japan and Korea, it was pretty easy to mobilize the US capitalist class and say, yeah, these are competitors. Let's force them to do things that will weaken them. China is different. The US can't exert, at least at this point, the kind of military control or political control. And the US capitalist class has kind of more mixed feelings. So for the US elite, labeling the China situation not just economic competitors, but threats, national security threats, provides a different way for them to try and get at China and to try and push it in the ways they want to this point with only minimum success, really. And I would also say, one way you can see this, there's a lot of attention in the media that the US is saying, well, the key to beating China militarily and economically is semiconductors, is AI, it's all these things. So we want to deny China the ability to get access to these. And so the US has passed laws saying US companies or any companies based in the US can't sell China machinery to make advanced semiconductors. But it turns out that that law is very limited, and so those same companies who operate in the US have foreign affiliates, and they're still selling those things to China. And and the US state has not had the ability or the willingness to try and close that loophole. And I think this is where the complex situation is for the US and why the US government and China hawks see China as such a threat, not just a competitor.
Yeah, the legal landscape there plays into it because not all of these laws are enforceable in other legal contexts. So I guess if it's like a subsidiary company of a US company operating in China, then they're not bound by the same laws that they would be in the United States. So you can't really enforce that. Um, same.
The US is doing that with Cuba. They've said, we have an embargo on Cuba, and to companies operating outside the US, if you use parts and components or technology from us, you can't sell those goods to Cuba. Now, maybe I don't know what the law is, maybe it's just the political pressure. But again, it's an example that what makes China so threatening to the US is that we're talking big companies and big money and integrated production, the globalization that makes these companies more resistant to this, which is ups the threat pot, the threat warning for US planners.
You've been watching part one of my conversation with economist Martin Hart-Landsberg. In part two, we'll be speaking about the history of World War II and the mobilization that was enabled by planning under the FDR government and how the left can actually learn lessons from that particular experience to enable a just transition. See you next time.